Remember that you can listen to this audio hours before its premiere and without advertising by subscribing to CesarVidal.tv.
The Voice with César Vidal from Exile. Very good morning, very good afternoon, very good evening, and very welcome to this new assignment of La Voz. I am César Vidal. Today is Monday, October 9th, 2023, and I am addressing the Spanish-speaking people of both hemispheres, those located on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and as always, I am doing so from exile. It was the year 2009 when the Wall Street Journal published an investigative piece by Andrew Higgins, in which a senior Israeli official acknowledged the role that Israeli intelligence had played in turning Hamas into a movement of political relevance among the Palestinians. In the cited Wall Street Journal piece, the Israeli official stated, "When I look back at the chain of events, I think we made a mistake, but at the time no one thought about the possible results." Higgins' report further detailed the assistance Israel had provided to Hamas and other Islamist forces in Gaza. That Israeli support for Hamas would also be denounced by Mark Cohen, the Israeli official responsible for religious affairs in Gaza until 1994. While watching the destruction of a neighbor's house by a Hamas rocket, Cohen traced the trajectory of the missile to what he called a huge and stupid mistake made 30 years ago. According to the former head of religious affairs in the Gaza Strip, a Tunisian-born Jew who has been active for more than 2 decades, never to my great regret is it a creation of Israel. According to Cohen, instead of trying to wipe out the Islamists in Gaza from the start, Israel had tolerated them for years and in some cases supported them as a counterweight to the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. In this way, Israel had cooperated with Yassin, the sheikh after whom the rocket-propelled grenades that Hamas would launch into Israeli territory were named. Just as significantly, in 1984, Sheikh Yassin was sentenced to 12 years in prison, but Israel released him after only 1 year in prison, considering him still a useful asset against the PLO. Ideas that seem brilliant at a given moment, but which are executed without the slightest moral consideration, often do not work, and on many occasions, as if it were an act of cosmic justice, are turned back on those who devised them, causing untold suffering to innocent people. Such a reality should lead us to conclude that politics without morality is essentially harmful and that morality cannot be replaced by mere propaganda of supposed moral superiority. Last weekend, Hamas launched an attack against Israel in which hundreds of people have so far perished. Without wishing to be exhaustive, the facts are as follows. First, Hamas began its activities in the 1960s as an extension of the Islamic movement of the Muslim Brotherhood operating in Egypt, which had been used by Britain to try to undermine the government of nationalist leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. Second, precisely for that reason, in 1966, Nasser tried to control the Muslim Brothers and proceeded to execute Said Qutb, one of the leading intellectuals of this Islamist group. Third, in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel occupied, among other territories, the Gaza Strip. which had previously been controlled by Egypt. Contrary to what might have been expected, Israel did not proceed to expel or wipe out the branch of the Muslim Brothers ever led by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Fourth, the reason for Israel's decision to allow Hamas activities was that it believed it would serve as a counterweight to the influence of the Palestine Liberation Organization among Palestinians. The PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, was secular and in keeping with the dynamics of the liberation movements of the time. But it enjoyed considerable international backing, despite perpetrating terrorist actions. Fifth, during the 1970s, Israel continued to support Hamas on an ongoing basis, allowing it to develop a social assistance network that helped it to increase its influence among Palestinians. Sixth, thus, in the year 1979, Israel legalized the organization of Sheikh Yassin Mohammed al-Islamiyah, which established a network of schools, clinics, a library, and kindergartens, increasing its influence over the Palestinians by supplying them with a network of social coverage not provided by the Israeli occupier. Seventh, Israel also supported the establishment of the Islamic University of Gaza, which would later be considered a hotbed of militancy and in which Operation Cast Lead from 2008 to 2009 was bombed by Israeli aircraft. Eighth, in this way, throughout the 70s and a good part of the 80s, Hamas established itself as a political force of stature in the style of the Taliban, helped by the United States in Afghanistan. This Israeli backing enabled Hamas to make the leap to major politics in 1888 during the First Intifada, and to do so by launching a charter in which it expressly refused to accept the existence of the State of Israel. Ninth, only after the Oslo Accords of 1933, when Israel agreed to recognize the PLO as a partner in the so-called peace process, Hamas became one of Israel's main enemies. Tenth, Hamas thus refused to accept Israel or renounce violence and became the most important Palestinian resistance organization against the occupation, which explains its popularity to this day. 1/10, in the year 2004, Yassi was killed in the course of an Israeli bombing, but 3 years later he never won the elections in a landslide, a victory to which Israel reacted by proceeding to blockade Gaza and attempting to make the area hermetically sealed, an act condemned by international law. 10th, in 2008 and 2009, the Israeli offensive against Gaza ended with the death of 1,383 Palestinians in the course of 3 weeks, a terrible confrontation that would be repeated several times in the following years. 13th, Benjamin Netanyahu is the current Prime Minister of Israel and also the longest-serving Prime Minister, having been in office for more than a decade and a half. 14th, following a series of corruption allegations in 1997, the Israeli police recommended his prosecution for influence peddling. Netanyahu's response was to appoint an attorney general to limit the charges to such an extent that he was not tried, claiming that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute him. 15th, 2 years later, in 1999, the Israeli police again recommended that Netanyahu be prosecuted for corruption, this time for having received $100,000 from a government contractor. The Attorney General decided not to prosecute, noting that there were difficulties with the evidence. 10th. 6th, on February 13, 2018, the Israeli police again recommended the prosecution of Netanyahu for corruption. According to the police, there were sufficient charges to prosecute him for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in 2 separate cases. Netanyahu refused to resign, but on November 25 of the same year, Lior Ben-Ari, head of the Economic Crimes Division, recommended that he be prosecuted in both cases. 17th. On February 28, 2019, the Attorney General of Israel announced his intentions to prosecute Netanyahu for bribery and fraud in 3 separate cases. 18th. On November 21st, 2019, Netanyahu was formally charged. The charges raised the prospect that Netanyahu could be sentenced to up to 10 years in prison for bribery and up to 3 years for fraud and breach of trust. Netanyahu thus became the first minister in Israel's history to be charged with a crime in office. 19th. On November 23, 2019, Netanyahu was forced to relinquish his portfolios of agriculture, health, social affairs, and diaspora affairs. On January 28, 2020, Netanyahu was officially charged with the commission of the offenses. The trial was to have taken place in March 1920, but the coronavirus crisis delayed it while Netanyahu significantly adopted one of the world's most restrictive policies regarding confinement and vaccinations, a policy that was courageously denounced by many Israeli citizens. At 2022, while the criminal proceedings against Netanyahu were still ongoing, he again became Prime Minister of Israel at the head of a coalition government. On December 29, 2022, Netanyahu was officially sworn in at the beginning of his 6th term. 21st. One of the first measures advanced by Netanyahu as president of the government was to promote a new regulation that would not only prevent him from being removed from the presidency of the government, but would also give him control over the judges. 22nd, with a vote of 63 in favor and 47 against in a 120-seat parliament, the new law would give the government a majority in the institution that selects judges in Israel. 23rd. Netanyahu's action ignored President Isaac Herzog's request to halt this legislative process and to carry out a judicial reform worthy of the name based on the agreement of the various political forces. 24th. The Netanyahu government's draft virtually eliminated the possibility for the Supreme Court to annul laws and decisions derived from the government and allowed the coalition to re-legislate with a simple parliamentary majority bills that had already been declared inadmissible by the courts. 25th. Among the rights that could not be protected by the Supreme Court would be those of equality, freedom of expression, due process, freedom of religion, and freedom of association. 26th. In addition, the law would give the government control over 8 of the 9 votes of the Judicial Selection Committee, including that of the Chief Justice. 27th. In the face of Netanyahu's action, the President of Israel would claim that Israel was marching toward the abyss and was on the verge of constitutional and social collapse. 28th. The legislation promoted by Netanyahu would have been a way for him to escape from the delicate legal situation in which he was immersed, since, for example, appeals on any possible conviction would be decided by judges appointed by his government, and the reactions against the legal changes proposed by Netanyahu were not long in coming, even to the point of some episodes of violence. 29th. Particularly serious was the reaction of Israeli reservists who decided not to attend the military exercises in protest against a legal reform which, from their point of view, endangered the very existence of the State of Israel. 30th. This tense situation has been running parallel to a growing repression of Palestinians living in the Israeli-occupied territories. By August 6 of this year, more than 200 Palestinians had been killed by Israeli forces or settlers in the occupied territories, leading the UN to state that the year 2023 was on track to become the deadliest year for Palestinians since it had begun to keep track of the violent deaths of Palestinians. Deaths suffered by the Palestinians. 31st. Thus, on August 16, Israeli troops in the West Bank killed 3 Palestinians in a car. The reason given for these deaths was that the Palestinians were on their way to carry out an attack. 32nd. Just a few hours later, Israeli settlers killed a Palestinian, an act that led the Israeli minister, Avid Ichter, to insist that the action carried out by the settlers could not be classified as a terrorist attack. 33rd. Just over a week later, another Palestinian youth detained by Israeli military forces in Arab Jerusalem was brutally beaten and branded on his cheek with the Star of David, according to various Israeli media reports. 34th. On August 30, another Palestinian youth, this time 15 years old, was killed by Israeli occupation forces near Damascus Gate in Arab Jerusalem. 35th. Of particular relevance, last September, the United Nations Security Council once again condemned the fact that Israel maintains occupied territories that affect not only the Palestinians, but also Syria, insisted on the illegality of the annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and reaffirmed the need for the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights, and reaffirmed the need to comply with international legality by allowing the creation of a Palestinian state. Although the Western press hushed up these statements, the truth is that they left Israel in a very bad position by recalling its systematic non-compliance with international legality for decades, and how even that non-compliance had worsened appreciably under Netanyahu. 36th. On Thursday of last week, hundreds of Orthodox Jews rallied in the vicinity of the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site for Islam, carrying out actions that were considered by Muslims as a humiliating provocation. 37th. The actions of these hundreds of Jews coincided with complaints from Christians who had been spat at on several occasions during the same dates. The government of Israel would present its apologies to the Vatican for this last episode. 38. Appealing to the actions of the Orthodox Jews as an offense to be avenged, Sabbath never unleashed a land, sea, and air offensive on Israel. 39th. The offensive started from Gaza and for the first time ever not only bombed Israeli territory but also penetrated it, causing casualties to the Israeli army and civilian population and capturing soldiers and civilians. 40th. The initial success of the Hamas offensive provoked from the outset enormous criticism in Israel, given that its intelligence service is supposed to be the second in the world and its army is supposed to be among the top 5. Despite these circumstances, it allegedly neither foresaw nor stopped the action of what may qualify as a militia or a terrorist group, but certainly not as a regular army. 41st. In addition, in the Gaza area, there is what is possibly the largest monitoring system in the world. This system not only has infantry units, tank battalions, and a significant military aviation presence, but it also has observation posts with thermal detection mechanisms, motorized patrols, garrison observation posts, subway radar, reconnaissance drones, reconnaissance aircraft, autonomous motorized patrols, a fence system that detects any movement no matter how small, and a multi-level bomb-proof fence system. In other words, there is not the slightest logical explanation for the fact that it could never circumvent these controls, which have proven their effectiveness on many occasions. And above all, it is very difficult to explain that the Israeli military response was not articulated until 6 or 7 hours after the Hamas attack. 42nd. Significantly, the Navy, which did act from the outset to repel Hamas attacks, as was to be expected, had no problem at all in juggling them quickly and effectively. 43rd. Netanyahu's response was to announce that the situation was one of war, while the opposition called for the formation of a national concentration government. 44th. After a few hours and after unleashing several attacks on civilian targets in Gaza, Netanyahu called on the Palestinian civilian population to leave the area, since, according to his words, he intends to reduce Gaza to a deserted place. Such an abandonment is impossible in practice, since Israel would not receive the refugees and, in the case of Egypt, would mean hundreds of thousands of people abandoned in the desert. 45th, internationally, reactions were not long in coming. While the Iranian parliament was shouting death to Israel, the NATO nations expressed their support for Israel, and some politicians took advantage of the situation to demand an attack against Iran, one of Netanyahu's objectives for decades. 40th. 6th. Revealingly, it was discovered that the weapons used by Hamas terrorists were part of those provided by NATO to Ukraine. This program warned months ago that this eventuality was occurring, at least in part because of the proverbial corruption of the Ukrainian regime. 47th, Turkey distanced itself from the general NATO line by insisting that escalation of the conflict must be avoided. 48th, tellingly, on the streets of Europe and to a lesser extent America, thousands of Hamas supporters demonstrated to applaud its initial triumph over Israel. 49th, ominously, the European and American streets have also become the scene of clashes, occasionally violent, between supporters of the two sides in a conflict that is neither European nor American and does not affect the populations of those countries. And 50th, significantly, only Russia and Egypt have called for a ceasefire with international intervention to safeguard the lives of the prisoners and prevent further bloodshed. The tragedy began last Saturday with Israel's invasion. Hamas invading Israeli territory has undeniable facts, contains indisputable facts, such as the Palestinian attack with the killing and capture of prisoners, and the subsequent Israeli military reaction. There are other facts that cannot yet be fully gauged, such as the exact number of dead, wounded, and prisoners on both sides. And finally, there are others that are particularly relevant because they allow us to try to understand and analyze what happened. With the desired nuances, there are only two possible interpretations. The first, which is very close to what the Western media has been saying, would be that Hamas proceeded to attack Israel by surprise, achieving a truly unprecedented initial success in the attack. This interpretation, however, forces us to accept the thesis of enormous stupidity on both sides. In the case of Hamas, because it would have thought it could defeat one of the top 5 armies in the world, and in the case of Israel, because despite the immense control mechanisms surrounding Gaza, it has the second largest intelligence service in the world. The second largest intelligence service, one of the biggest globally, and having one of the most powerful armed forces on the planet, it allowed itself to be trapped by a mere militia, was incapable of reacting with the exception of the Navy for at least 6 hours, and thus left its population helpless in the face of death, destruction, and captivity. It would necessarily follow that the Mossad and other intelligence services and the Israeli army have far more stupid and incompetent people in their ranks than we could ever have imagined. Not surprisingly, such a thesis has been rejected within Israel itself, and not a few Israeli citizens attribute this undeniable failure to the conscious action of a Netanyahu, whom they distrust and fear the worst. This is precisely where the second possible interpretation comes into play. According to this interpretation, both Israel's intelligence and military were fully aware of what was coming. They could have aborted the Hamas offensive immediately, as indeed the Navy did, but chose not to react in order to create a situation that would be particularly favorable to Netanyahu. The brutal Hamas attack, known in advance and not prevented, but allowed to go on for several hours with practically no military action, would allow Netanyahu to rally the citizens around himself, forgetting the pending legal cases and especially his project to liquidate the Israeli army, and above all his project to liquidate the independence of the judiciary. It would have placed a certain sector of public opinion in his favor, and above all, it would allow him to resume one of those objectives that he has been confessing for decades, to go to war against Iran, which at this very moment has broken its international isolation and is pursuing a policy of rapprochement with its great adversary in the area, Saudi Arabia. All this would also take place when just a few days ago, the United Nations Security Council reiterated the illegality of the territorial occupation that Israel has maintained for decades, the illegality of the annexation of the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem, and the imperative need for Israel to comply with international law, allowing the creation of a Palestinian state. As the Israeli newspaper Haaretz pointed out in an editorial yesterday, the Prime Minister, who has boasted of his vast political experience and irreplaceable wisdom in security matters, completely failed to identify the dangers to which he was consciously leading Israel when he established a government of annexation and dispossession. Netanyahu, Haaretz added, adopted a foreign policy that blatantly ignored the existence and rights of the Palestinians. Whichever way you look at it, and whatever nuances you want, either interpretation exposes the dreadful reality that hundreds or perhaps millions of innocent people on both sides will be sacrificed on the altar of political interests. Predictably, Israel will prevail, it could be otherwise, over Hamas and raze Gaza to the ground to perhaps unimaginable limits. But the problem will remain, because that problem includes not only Israel's right to live in peace and tranquility, but also that of the Palestinians to have their own state, to see the departure of Israeli occupation forces from their lands, and to non-interference by foreigners in their existence, as was, for example, Israel's support for Hamas. These realities cannot be avoided with the handouts provided by the United States and Western Europe to Palestinians who, if they could have their own state, regain full control of their territories and exploit their resources, would not need them. Whether we like it or not, we have to accept that Israel's aggression in the year of the Arab Spring, the year of the war between Israel and Israel, an aggression that some of the Israeli protagonists have already told us, was not due to an external threat, but to Israel's desire to control Syria's water wealth, is at the root of this drama that has not ended, because this aggression was also followed precisely by the occupation of territories that were not part of the State of Israel. We have to accept that the continuation of this occupation, the humiliation and violence suffered daily by the Palestinians, the support for groups such as Hamas in an attempt to divide them, and the continuous injustices that result in illegal evictions of homes, in the usurpation of fields to hand them over to Israeli settlers, and in unjustified acts of violence against the Arab population, all play an essential role in the hatred, violence, and resentment. We have to accept that also part of this tangle of violence is Israel's non-compliance with the Oslo agreements that could have opened a path to peace, but which were followed by Israel's action in establishing more settlements in the occupied territories than ever before, thus making the creation of a Palestinian state impossible simply because it has been continuously and systematically deprived of territory. And we have to accept that this decades-long process of violence, suffering, and tears, for which Netanyahu bears no small responsibility, can only be brought to an end by the end of the Israeli occupation, or by a dreadful ethnic cleansing that will wipe out the Palestinians, thus dashing the dreams of people like Netanyahu. The only legal and moral way out would be an international conference that would put an end once and for all to the occupation and also to the violence suffered by both sides, and open the way to two independent, free and sovereign states. As long as this is not the case, we will never dream of putting an end to Israel, and Israeli politicians like Netanyahu will dream of dragging us into more confrontations in the Middle East that endanger not only peace in the region, but also in the world. Because the terrible and inescapable choice of this conflict is that politics devoid of morality can lead to victories and successes, but in the end it always has very bitter consequences. When a terrorist group is supported in order to weaken the adversary or to be able to govern, when arms are given to an immensely corrupt government that then resells them to terrorist groups, when it is thought that from the sowing of hatred will come peace, when respect for human rights is geographical but not real and universal, when even the population itself is allowed to perish in order to alter the situation in one's own political favor, when politics is reduced to a simple power game without moral considerations, and when, in spite of this blatant immorality, values that are blatantly denied by one's own actions are wielded. When all this happens, in whole or in part, the result is injustice and violence, hatred and blood, and the unspeakable suffering of innocent people crushed and crushed by the wheel of immorality in politics. That is a lesson to be remembered before that same morality-less politics ends up precipitating the world into a world war whose devastation would far surpass that of the previous two. But do not be discouraged or frustrated, for although the mighty often appear to be giants, it is only because they are seen on their knees that it is time to stand up. Meanwhile, in the time it has taken you to listen to this editorial, the Spanish public debt has increased by more than 7 million euros, and it seems that part of it has been dedicated to buying weapons that have been delivered to Ukraine so that Ukraine can give them to the terrorists of Neverland. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. César Vidal has spoken to you from exile. May God bless you.
This section is sponsored by crowdfunding with the following message. Our Lord Jesus Christ, the only true God, is merciful and our Savior.